Have you ever wondered how a person could go from a poor, beaten child to one of the most brutal dictators the world has ever seen? It's a shocking transformation that seems almost unbelievable. Yet that was the path traveled by Saddam Hussein, the infamous former president of Iraq whose reign was marked by oppression, aggression, and unimaginable cruelty toward his people. His story demonstrates how ambition, violence, and a total disregard for human life can produce a modern-day monster. Can you imagine growing up in such tragic circumstances that it sets someone on the path toward genocidal brutality? Let's take a look at Saddam's traumatic origins, his rise to power, and his ultimate downfall to see just how a dictator is created. Early traumatic life. Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937, in the small village of Al-Auja, near the Iraqi town of Tikrit. His entry into the world was extremely traumatic. Both his father, Hussein Abid al-Majid, and an older brother had died of cancer in the months before Saddam's birth, leaving his mother Subhatulfa al-Muslit distraught and feeling cursed. She truly believed the unborn Saddam was evil incarnate, referring to her pregnancy as Satan in my belly. In desperation, she tried unsuccessfully to abort him late in the pregnancy and even attempted suicide. Can you imagine the profound psychological effects this must have had on Saddam from the very start? His own mother rejected and feared his existence before he was even born. It's the type of primal trauma that can shape someone's entire personality and worldview. Saddam's difficult circumstances only continued after he was born. Abandoned by his mother in those first few months, he was taken in by an uncle named Khairallah Majid until his mother eventually remarried. When Saddam returned to live with her at around age 3, he was regularly beaten by his harsh stepfather, Hussein Ibrahim al-Muslit. A CIA report from years later stated that vicious beatings were used to wake him up in the mornings throughout his childhood. By the age of 10, Saddam had had enough of the constant abuse. He fled from home to Baghdad to live with his uncle Khairallah Talfa. This uncle, a devout Sunni Muslim with ties to the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party, would become a major influence on Saddam's worldview. Khairallah had been a veteran of an anti-British revolt and held fervent beliefs in Arab nationalism, resentment of Western imperial powers, and the superiority of the Arab people over ethnic minorities within Arab lands. Can you see how the seeds of Saddam's later brutality may have been planted in these childhood hardships? The rejection by his mother, the constant beatings, and being taken in by an ideologically driven uncle, it was the perfect storm to breed resentment, anger, and a thirst for power in young Saddam. Embracing ideology and violence. During his formative teenage years in Baghdad, Saddam was exposed to the turbulent currents sweeping through Iraq and the wider Arab world in the 1940s and 50s as nationalist movements grew. The country had been a British protectorate after World War I, with the Hashemite monarchy installed by London. However, there were growing calls across the Arab world for self-determination and Arab nationalist movements that sought to oust Western imperial powers and unify the Arab people under one flag. Iraq's own pan-Arab Ba'ath Party espoused many of these same ideologies that resonated with Saddam and his uncle. The party sought to create a secular, one-party socialist Arab state by toppling the pro-British monarchies like the Hashemite rulers of Iraq. So at age 20 in 1957, Saddam joined the Ba'ath movement, attracted by their revolutionary goals and desire for a unified Arab identity that transcended religious sects like Sunni or Shiite. After just a few years, he dropped out of law school to dedicate himself fully to the party's mission. It was clear from an early age that Saddam was drawn to violence and power. Just a year after joining the Ba'ath movement, in 1959, he was already part of an assassination squad that tried and failed to kill the new Iraqi Prime Minister, Abd al-Karim Qasim. Saddam was struck by a bullet in the attempted assassination, but the failed hit demonstrated his ruthlessness and willingness to use violence for political aims while still in his early 20s. Rise to power. Over the next decade, a series of coups and counter-coups roiled Iraq, with Saddam and the Ba'athists biding their time. He fled to Egypt for a period after the failed assassination attempt before returning when the situation was more favorable. Do you think being shot and having to watch the brutal jockeying for power in those years further hardened Saddam's outlook, made him even more determined to seize control through any means necessary? Then, in 1968, the Ba'ath Party finally seized control in a coup led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a relative of Saddam's from Tikrit. This marked the beginning of Saddam's rise through the party ranks. Al-Bakr made his young relative Saddam a key figure in building up the party's security forces and stranglehold over the population. Over the next decade, Saddam formed loyal paramilitary squads from his own tribe and grew even more vicious in consolidating Ba'athist control. He reputedly perfected an astonishing 107 different interrogation techniques, including electrocution, burning victims' eyes, pulling out fingernails, and even using chemical weapons like mustard gas. Can you fathom employing such sadistic torture methods? This wasn't just military intelligence gathering. This was inflicting pain for fear and absolute obedience. Saddam was ensuring total domination over the Iraqi population through intimidation and evil practices that most of us can barely even imagine. Seizing total control. While al-Bakr was the regime's public face in those initial years, it was Saddam who steadily consolidated the true power behind the scenes throughout the 1970s. He proved himself a master at exploiting familial connections and tribal ties to expand his intelligence and security networks. By 1979, Saddam's position was so unshakable that he felt confident enough to force the increasingly ailing 62-year-old al-Bakr to resign at gunpoint in one of history's most brazen power grabs. Saddam called a meeting of the top Ba'ath Party and government officials under the pretext of uncovering a conspiracy against the Iraqi leadership. In a shocking televised display of cruelty, he had anyone deemed disloyal to his rule taken into the next room one by one and executed by firing squad. As politicians sat paralyzed, desperately pledging their loyalty in a bid to be spared, Saddam calmly smoked a cigar, confidently cementing his iron-fisted rule over Iraq. Can you imagine the sheer terror in that room? Having to watch one by one as your colleagues were led away to their deaths, not knowing if you'd be next. This was Saddam making clear to all of Iraq that no voice of dissent would be tolerated. Through brutal intimidation, he had finally seized the total control he'd worked towards for over 20 years. Reign of Terror. As president, Saddam quickly proved to be a terrifying and utterly merciless dictator on a level that few modern leaders could match. In 1980, he rashly launched an invasion of neighboring Iran, igniting an 8-year war that killed over 1 million soldiers and civilians on both sides in one of the 20th century's bloodiest conflicts. The justification was a mix of Saddam's wounded ego from Iraq's humiliating loss to Iran decades earlier in 1975, as well as his desire to position himself as the new leader of the Arab world by defeating the Persian, Shiite-ruled nation of Iran. The Kuwait Anfal attacks. To crush opposition among Iraq's Kurdish minority, who face severe discrimination for their distinct ethnic and cultural identity, Saddam employed chemical weapons in attacks like the 1988 Anfal genocide, which killed up to 100,000 Kurdish civilians. Torture, massacre, and ethnic cleansing were all exploited by Saddam to subdue any perceived threats to his authority and vision of an Arab nationalist Iraqi state ruled by fear. Meanwhile, at home, Saddam worked tirelessly to cultivate an overwhelming cult of personality that portrayed him as an anointed leader and manifestation of Arab greatness. He authored a novella titled Sabawi al-Khair, or Whetting the Appetites, that was distributed in schools, presenting a mythical, heroic account of Saddam's own life story. Monuments, statues, portraits, palaces, and buildings bearing his name sprouted up across Iraqi cities. Every year on his birthday, a new commemorative statue was unveiled as a gift to the Iraqi people, further enshrining his cult-like status. Portraits were mandatory in all public buildings, schools, shops, restaurants, even people's private homes. Iraqis had to carry portraits of Saddam on their person at all times or risk brutal punishment. Saddam's propaganda machine portrayed him as the latest inheritor of Mesopotamian glories, the new Nebuchadnezzar or Saladin. One pamphlet circulated in Iraqi schools declared, "Saddam is the soul of Iraq and the dream of the Arab nation, and the fires of rebellion against him will never be extinguished." This narcissistic self-aggrandizement likely stemmed from Saddam's own childhood feelings of abandonment, neglect, and low self-worth that he was so obsessively overcompensating for. Can you imagine living under such a totalitarian personality cult, where your leader's face is inescapable, staring at you from every wall, his name lauded in revisionist history lessons? It was a level of disturbing social control, unlike anything we've seen in the modern world outside of regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union or Kim's North Korea. The enormous personality cult allowed Saddam to cast off his traumatic upbringing and fashion himself as an all-powerful figure to be both feared and revered across Iraqi society. Any hint of dissent or opposition was crushed through his well-honed system of torture, imprisonment, and murder. Saddam ruled through unrestrained terror and brutality. Invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War. Saddam's egotistical delusions of grandeur and greed for power and resources led him into a series of calamitous foreign policy blunders in the 1980s and 90s that ultimately sowed the seeds of his downfall. Still stinging from his inability to decisively defeat Iran, in 1990 Saddam manufactured a pretext to invade oil-rich Kuwait and seize its assets after demanding wildly exorbitant payments from the Kuwaiti government. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990 was a shockingly brazen act even for him. His Republican Guard forces rapidly overran the Kuwaiti military and captured the nation within days. Saddam then proclaimed Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province and installed a puppet regime to govern the newly assimilated territory. The naked aggression caused global outrage and fears that Saddam would next set his sights on Saudi Arabia's oil fields. A massive military coalition led by the United States quickly assembled to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait in what became known as the Gulf War. The coalition dwarfed even the Allied powers that fought against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan decades earlier, drawing military support from dozens of nations across the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Saddam's role in Desert Storm. The ensuing air campaign against Saddam's forces in early 1991 devastated Iraqi military infrastructure, arms depots, and troop formations, with the coalition's superiority in precision bombing and electronic warfare. When the ground offensive was finally launched in late February, the remaining Iraqi forces were swiftly routed in just 100 hours. As coalition tanks and troops poured across the border into southern Iraq itself, Saddam made one final desperate, vindictive decision. He ordered his retreating soldiers to detonate oil well charges across Kuwait, resulting in a massive environmental catastrophe. Over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells were set ablaze, creating a hellish scene of towering black smoke columns that blocked out the desert sun for over a year. The toxic soot rained down across the region, causing widespread damage to agriculture, health crises, and severe economic losses. It was a final, petulant act of eco-terrorism by the defeated Saddam to punish Kuwait for his failure. Crushing internal uprisings. At home, Saddam's humiliation at the hands of the U.S.-led coalition sparked uprisings against his regime across Iraq by long-oppressed groups like the Kurdish separatists in the north and Shiite Muslim populations in the south. Rebel militias seized control of dozens of cities as the demoralized Iraqi military crumbled. Sensing a chance to at last overthrow the hated dictator, they waged an open revolt in March 1991. Saddam reacted quickly and with his trademark disproportionate brutality. He unleashed his remaining loyal Republican Guard units equipped with helicopter gunships to indiscriminately attack towns and villages across the Kurdish north and Shiite south. Massacres, chemical weapon attacks, and wanton destruction were Saddam's scorched earth policy to crush the uprisings over just a few weeks. The rebels, mainly infantry units made up of defectors and lightly armed militias, proved no match for Saddam's heavy weaponry and wanton disregard for civilian casualties. Horrific scenes of streets strewn with bodies, including many women and children, played out across Iraq as the dictator reasserted his control through mass murder. Graphic images of these atrocities reached international media, sparking outrage around the world. But the U.S.-led coalition, having achieved its narrow objective of liberating Kuwait, opted not to intervene and overthrow Saddam directly. This decision would be criticized for decades as a missed opportunity to remove the ruthless dictator from power. With the uprisings crushed, Iraq was left decimated, its infrastructure in ruins, its economy a shambles, and hundreds of thousands of its people killed. The United Nations imposed crippling economic sanctions that remained in effect throughout the 1990s, further punishing the Iraqi population by blocking outside food, medicine, and infrastructure supplies from entering. But did these sanctions truly punish Saddam himself, or just the innocent Iraqi civilians who suffered a lack of drinking water, malnutrition, and horrific health crises, and barely survived in the bombed-out remains of their cities? While the regime's inner circle maintained their lavish lifestyles, over 500,000 Iraqi children were estimated to have died during the sanctions due to the humanitarian crisis conditions. Meanwhile, Saddam continued his usual megalomania, spending what funds were available not on rebuilding Iraqi society, but on more lavish palaces, mosques, and vanity projects celebrating himself. New statues and monument-building programs depicting Saddam as a conquering hero and beloved leader went forward even as the population around them starved and fell into squalor. Ever paranoid, Saddam also routinely had members of his own Ba'ath Party intelligence service imprisoned, tortured, or executed on the mere perception of disloyalty. It's estimated thousands of Iraqi officials suffered this fate in random purges during the 1990s. Saddam demanded absolute obedience and fealty from those around him at all times. He also continued to defy UN weapons inspectors on the ground, refusing them access to suspicious sites and impeding investigations into whether Iraq was covertly rearming and reconstituting its weapons of mass destruction programs. This included rebuilding stocks of chemical weapons, restoring biological weapons research, and pushing to restart efforts to pursue nuclear arms, all of which would be a blatant violation of the UN's terms for lifting sanctions. Can you imagine having such little value for human life and regard for your own citizens, that you would actively block humanitarian aid from reaching starving children while building more monuments to glorify yourself? This was the depravity and moral sickness of Saddam Hussein's decadent regime in the 1990s. By the end of the decade, it was becoming clear to global observers and intelligence agencies that Saddam had not been cowed by the Gulf War loss or weakened sanctions. He seemed as determined as ever to be the dominant force in the Middle East, even if it meant obliterating his domestic population to do so. This intransigence and stockpiling of banned weapons set the stage for the 2003 invasion of Iraq by a US-led coalition. Fall from power. When the invasion was launched in March 2003 to overthrow Saddam and destroy any WMD programs, Iraq's bloated million-man military and vaunted Republican Guard proved unable to stop the technologically superior American forces from swiftly advancing on Baghdad. Saddam's forces were demoralized from over a decade of deprivation under UN sanctions. Their Soviet-era equipment and defensive tactics were hopelessly obsolete against the coalition's precision-guided munitions and modern warfare capabilities. Within just 3 weeks, the capital city had fallen along with Saddam's iron grip on power that he had brutalized the Iraqi population to maintain for over 2 decades. Iconic images emerged of Iraqis joyously destroying the omnipresent statues, portraits, and symbols of their former dictator across Baghdad and other cities. Saddam had become as reviled as he was once forced to be revered. For Iraqi civilians who had suffered so much under Saddam's heel, it sparked delirious celebrations of freedom from his psychopathic rule. But it also kicked off a complete breakdown of civil order, security forces, and rule of law that would contribute to years of chaos, sectarian violence, and instability in Iraq. As for Saddam himself, once U.S. forces and their Iraqi allies gained control of the capital region, the now deposed dictator went into hiding along with his sons and top lieutenants. For months, they evaded the intense manhunt being carried out by coalition forces, moving frequently between grungy safe houses and rural farms across central Iraq. Saddam had long been fond of constructing elaborate underground bunker systems to shelter from airstrikes, so it was perhaps fitting that he was finally found on December 13, 2003, disheveled and trapped in a small underground hideout near a rural farmhouse in the village of Ad-Dar, just 10 miles from his hometown of Tikrit. After nearly 25 years as Iraq's unchallenged dictator, who had struck such a fearsome presence, the man who had orchestrated so much death and destruction was captured in an anticlimactic hole in the ground. When U.S. forces discovered his cramped underground bunker, the once arrogant Saddam had to be pulled out, begging, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." It was a pathetic ending for a tyrant who had promoted himself as a modern Saladin, destined to lead the Arab world to glory. The disheveled, disoriented former president offered no resistance as he was bound and transported to a holding facility. His reign of terror was finally over. Trial and execution. Saddam was eventually put on trial by the new Iraqi government in 2005, finally facing justice for the litany of crimes and atrocities his regime had committed over the decades against his people. The trial was a challenging and chaotic legal proceeding, with Saddam defiantly lashing out and repeatedly disrupting the courtroom, forcing judges at times to remove and later reinsert him. Throughout the proceedings, the once untouchable dictator displayed a stunning lack of remorse, arrogantly rejecting the legitimacy of the court and the charges against him. At one point, he even had to be taken out of the courtroom after repeatedly shouting, "Down with George Bush," at the proceedings. But after a year of tumultuous trial and nearly $1 billion in costs, Saddam was ultimately convicted in November 2006 of crimes against humanity for his role in the torture and killings of 148 Shiite Muslim men and boys in the town of Dujail in 1982. The atrocities in Dujail were carried out after a failed assassination attempt on Saddam during a visit there. Over 20 years later, Saddam and his intelligence chiefs were finally held to account for carrying out widespread torture, illegal imprisonments, murder, and the destruction of orchards in the farming town as collective punishment for its residents. It represented just a tiny fraction of the tens of thousands of human rights violations carried out by his regime over the decades. As his guilty verdict was read out, Saddam remained steadfastly defiant, gesturing defiantly at the judge and shouting, "You go to hell!" When asked if he had any final words, he rambled and gave a household prayer, then shouted, "Palestine is Arab," as the noose was put around his neck on December 30th, 2006. Seconds later, the hangman opened the trap door and Saddam Hussein fell through to his death, ending one of the most brutal chapters for Iraq and the world. His demise sparked both celebrations and further violence across Iraq, as the simmering sectarian divides he had held together through sheer oppression boiled over into open conflict between Sunni and Shiite Muslim factions. In the power vacuum that followed Saddam's ouster, Iraq descended into a violent civil war that would rage for years, further destabilizing the already fragile nation. With the iron grip of the dictator removed, long-standing ethno-religious tensions and militias that had previously been crushed erupted with bombings, ethnic cleansing, and tit-for-tat killings. The country remains bitterly divided along sectarian lines to this day, its future still very much unsettled over 15 years after the violent upheaval triggered by Saddam's downfall. Perhaps that is his most enduring legacy: the chaos, bloodshed, and residual trauma he inflicted on the Iraqi people through his decades of totalitarian misrule and vicious efforts to destroy any perceived opposition to his power. Saddam Hussein legacy. Saddam Hussein cast a dark shadow of violence and cruelty across Iraq and the entire world during his 24 years of tyrannical rule from 1979 to 2003. His shocking transformation from a poor, abused child into a megalomaniacal dictator demonstrated the horrifying depths of cruelty possible in just one individual human being. Saddam Hussein's reign was one of the darkest periods in recent history for the people of Iraq, as well as for the broader Middle East. His brutal oppression of ethnic minorities and Iraq's Shiite Muslim majority was carried out through a vast campaign of terror tactics like torture, mass killings, and oppression. Saddam Hussein's path started even before his terrible childhood experiences, beginning with his biological mother informing him that she did not want a child. He was the result of her affair with an abusive husband, which she never forgave. Thus began a dysfunctional, traumatic family life for the young Saddam that fueled his path towards becoming a tyrannical monster himself when he got older. More of the sordid details of Saddam's personal life as an autocratic ruler should be mentioned, like his masterpieces, which were how he pompously referred to his nuclear weapons program that he was advancing to give himself military superiority over ethnic Kurd factions and Shia Muslim sect rivals inside Iraq itself, as well as some of Iraq's other enemies, like America at that time. These masterpieces were among the first things he ordered made as the new dictator of Iraq after siding with the radical militant imams clerics who taught him extremist ideologies from a very young age. So not only did the young Saddam Hussein endure an unstable, abusive childhood home environment because of his mother, but then as an adult, he followed in the zealous footstep of radical clerics and militant men of violence that he had encountered in Baghdad, and all the while he admired force and vile power struggles. He was driven towards that, but then made an active, blasphemous choice to absolutely push things even further in that direction himself. In the end, his own increasingly militant, extremist activities against others included his own tragic plight in some of the worst, most physically and mentally oppressive and abusive form against some of the other people he knew. So what can this entry say about the human mind and spirit behind Saddam Hussein? Put bluntly, this was a man who followed a sick pathway of militant zeal, not just against others, but ultimately against himself and his own humanity as well.